The following is a presentation from the MJCast, the internet's premier podcast on all things Michael Jackson.
I'm a Black American. I am proud of who I am.
Together, we can make a change in the world. I want to see you!
I like to take sounds and put them under the microscope.
There's a driving bass, you become the bass.
Let the music write itself.
I don't sing it if I don't mean it.
Welcome to the MJCast, your source of news, discussion, and interviews on the King of Pop. Hello and welcome to the MJCast. I'm your host, Jamon Bull, and today I'm here with two great people, both professional film editors, in fact, but I'll get a little more into that soon. Today, friend of the show, Paul Black, is joining me again to interview a Michael Jackson collaborator and award-winning professional film editor, Mr. Bob Jenkis. Bob has had a long and rewarding career in film, working on Oscar-winning documentaries and music videos for some of the most well-known artists in the world, including Fleetwood Mac, Madonna, Prince, Janet Jackson, Quincy Jones, James Brown, and Donna Summer. Interestingly, Bob also had a collaborative relationship with film director David Lynch, and it's this relationship that brought he and Michael Jackson into each other's spheres, where they worked together on projects throughout the 90s and beyond. We are going to dig into all of that shortly. Before we chat with Bob, Paul, how are you doing?
I'm great. Sitting here, Studio Sydney, ready to rock.
That's great. Thanks for joining me again. We've just done the Ghost Roundtable recently where we talked a lot of film, and it's really exciting that we can be here together, I think, with Bob, where we can talk to another film editor.
Absolutely. We'll get into all the technical and all the fun stuff of editing, but hopefully it won't be too technical for all the people out there.
I can't wait to hear you guys geek out. I'm just saying. But anyway, let's bring Bob in. So, Bob, welcome to the MJCast. Where are you calling in from today?
Thank you. Nice to be here. I'm in Los Angeles. It's early afternoon here, and excited about being with you guys and telling some stories.
We're really excited to have you here as well. And what we like to do at the very beginning of our interviews is we actually like to go way back into people's origins and how they, their childhoods and how they ended up getting into the fields that they did. So just to begin, would you be able to take us way back to those early days and the kind of upbringing you had?
Sure. Wow. Let's see. My parents were actually European immigrants from Latvia, where my dad was from. My mom was from Germany, and they came to the States in the early 50s after World War II. And a couple of the things that right from early on influenced me later was that my parents insisted on me taking piano lessons from when I was 4 years old. And I have to say I hated it most of that time, but eventually, and I pretty much stopped playing after I graduated from high school. But the last couple of years before that, I started to appreciate it more. I was always mostly playing classical music. I fell in love with Chopin, and and you would also play, of course, Beethoven and Bach and some Brahms. But the significant thing about that is that when my music video career started, it took me a while to realize how much of an influence those early piano lessons had on how I approached what I did as an editor. I just have kind of an innate sense for musical structure, or at least I understand musical structure. And but that was something that I didn't realize right away until some producers or directors I was working with and would ask about how I was doing things instinctively. And I said, well, doesn't everybody do it this way? And it turned out they didn't. And so I tracked that down eventually. But I mean, we can get into that a little bit later as well. The other thing that was instrumental for me was my dad was an avid amateur photographer. He had worked a little bit professionally as a journalist, and I think as a portrait photographer along the way. But it was never he was never able to make enough money at it to support the family. So it was always a hobby. One of the few things that when he fled Latvia at the end of World War II, before the Russians closed off the Baltics, was a Leica M3 camera, photochemical, so that he could develop and print his own pictures. And and of course he did that for us as I was growing up. And again, early on, my mom and I, a lot of times we would be rolling our eyes when dad would want to set up and take pictures, or where we are out on vacation. But eventually my own interest developed in that way. And I think also by the time I was in high school, I finally asked him to teach me how to develop and print pictures. We always had a dark room in the basement wherever we lived. And, of course, only doing black and white pictures, but he taught me how to develop and print black and white pictures. So I was doing that, and he had a Bolex 8 millimeter film camera for our home movies, and which was a pretty sort of high end film camera. And I started playing around with that as well. I there was a shift for me during high school, where early on I always thought that I was a relatively good student, and I thought I'd be interested in going into some sort of scientific career. But the huge disappointment of my young life was when I got into high school chemistry. And I had had this impression that chemistry was going to be, mixing things together and having, basically having setups like you see in the movies of a chemistry lab, with boiling beakers and, things, bubbling away and like that. And when I discovered that chemistry was really largely math, it was just disappointing to me to no end. And my whole sort of orientation switched. We had also had a kind of a film appreciation class in high school, but it wasn't about film. This was a class through the social studies department, where we were looking at films and talking about them from the character's psychological standpoint, or from a character's standpoint, not a filmmaking standpoint. But that fascinated me. I was not, let's say, very psychologically attuned, and so starting to understand motivations and just looking at characters in terms of why they did what they did in the movies that we saw was equally fascinating to me. So all of those things started coming together. I think it was my junior year in high school, and a math class I was in, the teacher was so disgusted with our apathy, the students' apathy towards what we were doing, that he just threw up his hands one semester and said, "Okay, we're going to do something different. You guys can do whatever you want for this semester. There's only two requirements. One is, at the beginning of the semester, you have to, you know, uh, say what it's going to be that you're going to do. You're going to, come up with some kind of project, and then at the end of the semester, you have to present the project." So that was something where I decided to make a little movie, and I wound up, with my dad's Bolex, I wound up taking Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young track called "Helpless" and making what I realize now was a music video to it. There's a couple of verses in the song that deal with big birds flying overhead is one of the lyrics that I remember. I don't remember them all right now. But what I did was I contrasted, basically. I made an anti-pollution video, whereas in the first verses I was shooting beautiful nature shots, and like when the reference with the birds came up, of actual birds flying overhead. And then as the song developed and I did the second verses, then all became about pollution and smokestacks and dirty water and airplanes flying overhead. And that was, kind of how I structured that thing out. So, and then I had it, my synchronization method was turning the film projector and my cassette recorder on at the same time, and achieving sync that way for my 4-minute video. And it was well received. But what it actually led to was there was another guy in high school who had been into movies for quite a while. He was almost like, when I think back on it, what Spielberg talks about his childhood of making little narrative films with his friends. That's what this guy was doing. And we were not friends before that, but he saw this little movie I made, and we started developing a friendship. And we wound up going to the same film school. We were roommates for 4 years, and eventually talked about coming out to LA and meeting up here and trying to get a job in the film business. So back to graduating from high school and going to film school, I was really kind of making it up as I went along. But my film school experience in Ohio was at Ohio University, which is in Athens, Ohio. It's on the border of Appalachia, and it's a beautiful part of southeastern Ohio. Smaller school, but they actually had a nationally recognized film program. It turned out they were preparing students to be film teachers was really the focus of the program there, and it was really designed to be a master's program. And eventually that, of course, my time in film school at that time, my first interest was in European art films. When growing up, my family, we would go to movies occasionally, but I was not a movie buff growing up. But it was, Godard, Truffaut, the French New Wave that really stimulated my interest in film. Mm. And I wound up focusing on film because everything I was interested in, from literature, psychology, art, was kind of focused around film. The movies that came out of Hollywood in the early 70s, the Friedkin and Coppola and even, early Spielberg, there was almost more of a personal expression aspect to those films. And of course, we were, Bergman, Godard, Truffaut, all of those were, not mainstream Hollywood films. The idea of film as entertainment was something, at least initially, I even looked down on. Maybe it's my European background, but I was into quote unquote serious films. But that led me to that's the basis of my education. I mean, in many ways beyond just my film education. So all that was very instrumental in shaping me as a person and as a filmmaker.
Great. A lot of us as filmmakers, we all got into film in a similar way. We fell in love with the art form, but I've spoken to a lot of editors, in particular fellow editors, and usually they fall in love with film and they want to be involved in it, but they don't always know where. And I don't know many people that start out by saying, I want to be an editor. They just fall in love with, the world of film and cinema and all of that. And then maybe, particularly in film school, you try all the different things and then somehow you land on editing that sort of clicks with you. What was it for you that sort of made editing the thing that you thought you wanted to do, or where you found your home in the art form?
Well, my falling into editing really was falling into it. I never particularly thought of wanting to be an editor. What happened was that after I graduated from college and decided to come out to LA, and I had decided midway through my college career that I wanted to actually work in the business, very much like you're describing. And of course, at the time, I guess there was a film scene in New York, but it was really about Los Angeles. And so I came out to LA in the fall of 1977. And I knew all of three people out here, a friend from college, somebody that I had met semi-professionally in Cleveland, where I'm from in Ohio originally, and an executive who worked at Warner Brothers. And so I got out here and, kind of said hello to people, and here I am. And, was, looking at in the trades and, just looking for a job. And after about 4 months, through one of these three connections, led me to auditioning for a job for a small production company that a guy was named Jerry Kramer was just starting. He had been a producer for another filmmaker named Chuck Braverman, and Chuck Braverman's claim to fame was I don't know if you guys are familiar with a TV show from the late 60s called The Smothers Brothers. They were an entertainment show that ran on American television for many years. And they would occasionally feature short art films or music films. And this guy, Chuck Braverman, was somebody that directed and produced things that were, for example, flash cuts that were entitled things like The History of Art in 3 Minutes. And he would pick a music track and basically do flash cuts of all the art that had been made in the Renaissance, for example, or something like that. So Jerry Kramer had been his producer and decided to start a company on his own. So Jerry was somebody that had music industry connections at the time. He had gone to law school with a guy named Jeff Aroff, who became a pretty well-known music executive, first at A&M Records and then at Warner Brothers, and then eventually had a label of his own called the Work Group. The record companies at the time were making little promos, occasional videos, but there was no market, no outlet for them here in the country. But there was in England, for example, there was a pretty well-known show called Top of the Pops that ran these promos. And then we were also doing little 10, 15, 30-second bits that record companies would use at record company conventions like BAM and NARM, where they would showcase whatever releases they had coming up. So this was Jerry's initial work that was coming in, and he hired me as a runner. I, had a car. I had driven out from Ohio to LA, and he liked my background in film. So that's what I started doing was running from the office to the labs. We were in Hollywood originally, and there were some labs in Hollywood, but also in Burbank, and there were constantly things that were needing to go back and forth. But as happens very often with small production companies like that, if you either show interest or have some aptitude, pretty quickly you get to start doing other things. One of the things that we were doing the most of was post-production. Even if, we would go out and shoot something, that would be, like half a day or a day. The post process obviously was a little bit more involved and took a little bit longer. We were working out of a little house in Hollywood, and actually, let's see now, Paul, or did you ever cut on film?
Yeah, a little bit. We started out at the AFI cutting on 35 for a while, and then a bit later in 16 mil.
So you know what an 8-plate chem is?
Yeah.
Chem and Steenbeck were the major editing tools at the time, although Steenbeck was more used on the East Coast and chems were the tool of choice out here. So we actually had 2 chems in this little house in West Hollywood off of Melrose Avenue. When I walked in there, there was a guy who was cutting some music films for Electric Light Orchestra that Jerry had shot, and we're just in the finishing process. This was, from the album that Mr. Blue Sky came off of, and those songs. Eventually, as these little promos went on, I got an opportunity to cut stuff. And Jerry was one of the people that figured out that I had a knack for doing that. And it was actually on a video that he directed that where there was an opening section of 16 bars, but 4 beats to each. And he had shot it so that there was something specific he wanted to use on each of those, but he didn't tell me about it. So he gave me the film when it came in, and I started cutting, and that's how I organized it. And he comes in to see what I've been working on. I show it to him. He said, "How did you know to do that?" And, so I explained, I said, well, it just seemed obvious to me that that's how the music was structured. So I, organized the material, picked the material that you had shot to go with that. And that's kind of when I realized that my music, my piano background, was something that was doing well for me at this point. People generally, even though they'd grown up with pop music and, maybe intuitively understood pop music structure, nobody really knew what a verse and a chorus and a bridge and all that was. But when I started, editing, that was kind of the path that I would follow. And executives and artists, of course, when musicians would come in, if they saw that you understood the music that they had made, that was all in our favor. And that's how I fell into editing. Jerry had a partner for a while, and both of them had various record company connections. And so the first full video that I cut was for the band Styx in, I don't know, 79, I think it was. And we had actually gone out on tour with them. I forget the name of the album, but it was the big hit that came out of that was the song Babe, which I did not cut, but I cut one or maybe 2 other songs from there. But we shot them a couple nights in concert. And I've always, again, thanks to my film school background and my dad's interest in photography, I've always been a pretty good camera operator. So, that was something else that came up during my tenure with Jerry Kramer. And so we shot a couple nights of them in concert of the band Styx. And then on the second day in the afternoon, we set up in the concert hall that we were in and shot more footage to playback of the concert from the night before. This is something that's commonly done. And we were only there with, God, I think 4 or 5 cameras. I mean, nowadays concerts are shot with 10, 15, 20 cameras and remote cameras, and, the coverage is all over the place. In those days, it was a much simpler time. And, we would have, 3 cameras in front of the stage and then maybe 1 backstage. And so shooting, a couple nights and then doing the afternoon shoot to playback was something that gave us more coverage. One of my other early experiences as a camera operator was we did went out on tour with Fleetwood Mac. And that was one of the things that there was a concert in St. Louis in 79, I think, that I was actually one of the on-stage cameras. There were 2 of us that were running around with cameras on stage. There was no video taps in those days. So we were, just all kind of following our instincts. And, I love doing that. I actually was not editing that much yet in those days, but there's a couple songs that are on YouTube from that concert that I have, shots in from when I was shooting Fleetwood Mac. Because we were doing more post-production, that was sort of the natural thing to get into. I liked it, obviously, and I was getting a little bit of a reputation as being one of those people that understood music. The other thing that goes along with those early days was, quick cutting. And, something, it became a bit of a cliche in music videos was that, they would be cut quicker and quicker. Attention spans were getting shorter. And I think one of the things that I had something to do with was style that, to my eye, I like obviously cutting quickly because I liked following the beats and the structure of the music. But I was not interested in creating confusion. And of course, in the early days of music videos, most of it was performance oriented. It wasn't really until the early Duran Duran videos that came out, and those were coming out of England, where the whole idea of conceptual music videos started being developed. Early on, it was pretty much all performance based, and so I like creating clarity. So for me, it was all about, I loved seeing the guitar player's hands on the guitar and then close up, because, you go to a concert, that's not what you're seeing. They didn't have video displays at the time. So doing music videos gave us a chance to see musicians up close in ways that you normally didn't at the time. And I think back on one of my favorite compliments that I got from a record company executive was, he said, I seem to have a knack for being able to make sense out of nonsense.
That's what we do.
That was something that I based that early part of my career on.
That's all phenomenal information. Thank you so much, Bob. I mean, I can really look back in the rearview mirror now and see all of these stepping stones and how they all led you to being able to work with Michael Jackson. Would you be able to walk us through how you first came into contact with Michael and his camp and how that all evolved?
Yes. A director named Mark Romanek, whom I imagine you know, was hired to, this was at the time when the black or white video from the Dangerous album was going to be premiered. And Mark, who eventually wound up directing the Scream video, was at this point hired to do the lead-in to the reveal or the premiere of the black or white video. Michael's people had set up a premiere on Fox television. It was a big, thing in the evening. It was, going to be premiered worldwide. And Michael had been a little off the radar for a while. So he wanted something that was some sort of retrospective to lead into the premiere of the video. And Mark Romanek had actually pitched Michael at some point on doing this retrospective, not to Michael's music, but to a piece of classical music of some sort, because, quote unquote, Michael is a classic. And Mark Romanek wanted to do something that was, not your usual musician band retrospective. So Michael liked that idea. And Mark and I had worked together before, so he hired me to start, to work on this with him. Well, he and Michael had some meetings, and they had been listening to classical music, and but had not found anything yet that they all agreed was, the thing to go with. And but there was, Michael made his entire video library available, and there was obviously a lot of material to go through. So I had started pulling things out, from his childhood, from, the famous videos, of course, and whatever had been done at that time. And, we were just experimenting with various pieces of classical music. Well, I want to say a month into this, Mark Romanek exited the project because he had a schedule conflict. And so at that point, Michael had seen some of the little snippets that I had been cutting just as examples, for what this might wind up looking like. And he said, well, let me meet the guy who's been editing this. So that led to my first meeting with Michael. And we had that at his manager at the time was a guy named Sandy Gallen, who was Dolly Parton's partner and, managed Michael for some time. And so they bring me over to Sandy's house and to have this meeting with Michael. And my first experience with him was, I met, Michael was sitting in the middle of the living room, and, he basically rehashes this idea of, what he liked about it and what they had. And he pulls out a cassette and he said, well, here, I want to, play what I've collected so far. So my first experience with Michael was going into Sandy Gallen's den and trying to figure out how to work the stereo system, because of course Sandy did not know how to do that. And Michael and I are standing there punching buttons on the stereo and running into the living room to see if any audio was coming out. And it was just kind of funny and fun, and it, I always had like a little bit of a playful interchange with Michael, and it goes back to that. And of course, finally, we got the thing going, and he had some various things that he had listened to, and we did, and we talked generalities, and off I went.
Just a quick question, sorry, just before you continue on, I've got to know, I mean, you obviously had interacted with some notable and famous people before this moment. Were you particularly the kind of guy to get starstruck? I mean, you're standing there trying to operate a stereo system with the king of pop, so...
No, fortunately, I'm not. I even have to say, I mean, of course, I loved Michael's music, but I was not a huge Michael Jackson fan. So, and maybe I had worked with enough celebrities at that point to not be starstruck. I'd really have to think about an experience because where I was, because when you're working with somebody, I mean, and it was like going back to my first job with Jerry Kramer, all of a sudden, Donna Summer would come in to look at something that we were working on, and there was almost like a casualness about that. And the thing is that you start to you see celebrities as human beings. It's not they don't act like quote unquote stars. I talked to a lot of colleagues about this over the years. The more successful, the higher up the chain they were, in many ways, the more humble they were, the more easy to communicate with they were. The ones that were either not doing so well or were more ambitious or were trying to prove something were the ones that would have more attitude and that were maybe more difficult to work with. But Michael was always very clear in many ways about what he wanted. I mean, he's obviously intimately involved with his image, with how he's presented, with all the aspects of the music, and he was, out of his whole life was experienced on all those levels. So even though he would not necessarily, there was always a collaborative element to it, and that's what was fun with this project, where was there was this experimentation about how would we accomplish this. What wound up happening was that Michael started calling me regularly and telling me about things that he wanted to have included, and this shaped how I wound up approaching this piece. Like I had said initially, it was supposed to be a retrospective of his career up until that time, so that the audience was kind of brought up to speed again on all the things that Michael had done over the years, and then the grand reveal of this new video. Well, I wound up taking a different approach to that for a couple of reasons, and this is how that came about. One of the things that Michael talked to me about a lot was the experience in concerts of girls fainting, and guys too. He talked about that a lot, and initially, I'm as much of a can be cynical as well, and they said, well, obviously this is Beatlemania, this is adulation, this is musician or a performance artist wouldn't like people screaming and fainting and doing all that. So that went on the list of things to include. But what happened along the way and what changed my mind about that was that as Michael would talk about how his performance experiences were, I started to realize that the screaming, fainting moments were actually the closest that Michael ever really got to interacting with his fans. He, obviously could not go out on the street without being recognized and mobbed. And there is an energy about these, Beatlemania is, also a good example. Elvis, there was, the out of control emotional expression element that audiences brought to these artists and to Michael was something that I realized he felt he matched in his performance. His music, it comes out of him. It is an organic, emotional, energetic expression, and that is where he met his audience in that. So when I realized that, that's when I started thinking about this intro promo piece in a different way. I had been familiar with Carl Orff's piece Carmina Burana before that, but as I had been working on this, that was kind of in the back of my mind, that the crazy energy of O Fortuna part of that composition was something that I could picture to these shots of audiences all jumping up and down together, and of people losing their shit and screaming and yelling, and that there seemed to be a connection there. So as my thinking evolved on this, and of course, then I'm pulling all this stuff out of his library, that started to take shape in that way. And are you guys have seen this piece, right?
Yeah.
Oh, like countless times.
So essentially, Bob, you're working on what became known as the Brace Yourself teaser, which, in many fans' minds and, possibly the world over, is considered the definitive, retrospective anthology, and kind of became the template for anything that came after that. But that was one of the very first significant ones that became like a huge thing. I mean, that's a daunting task, but it's just so impressive to hear that, you actually came up with the track that was going to be used, that Carl Orff piece. I'm just fascinated to know, like, you're creating this piece of saying this is pretty much, if anyone wants to know what Michael Jackson was about, that could be the one thing that you'd send them to see, to have a look at. Right. And I'm thinking you had access to the archives and you had access to all of this material, and I love this piece so much, and it was one of the things that really struck me as a fan. And I just thought, oh my God, this is amazing. And in a lot of ways was so inspired by the editing and the way you put it together, and certain movements that you would use, when it's got the da 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 boom boom, and you'd cut to the perfect movement. It was just phenomenal. And I'm just curious, I know a lot of that footage came from, there was various MTV specials and things, and you had access to a lot of these bits and pieces. Something was used here, something was used there. I mean, did you have to dig through raw concerts, like a 2-hour show, or is it like most of these pieces, like you're talking about Michael saying, I want this, I want that? Like, in terms of the material that you were working with,
right,
how long did you spend combing through material? Was it mostly pre-edited little reels and bits, or bits that Michael said, I want this? Like, talk us through what it was like trying to curate all of that material, and in what form it came,
right,
and in what format it was on, that kind of thing.
It was a little bit of both. A lot of it was, so to speak, pre-made or pre-existing.
Yeah.
The videos that I pulled from, that had been made at the time, television commercials. But some of the concert stuff was raw material. Michael would always have cameramen shooting the audience during the concerts. So a lot of that was not pre-edited. There were even particular people that Michael had watched, and that they had names in for them in the library. It's like, make sure he gets that girl, or or that guy, or that moment. And so they had been. And I don't remember, to tell you the truth, if they had been collated in maybe a rough kind of form, that there was a half-hour reel of girls screaming. There may well have been. So it was this combination of things. His archive is, it literally had everything that he had ever been involved in. But of course, once I had this idea of focusing on that, that kind of helped to narrow it down in terms of what I was asking his, librarian and archive people to pull for me. I did not talk to Michael about this at all, while I was doing this, and that's something I want to is a part of this story that might be interesting. Once I decided on using Carmina Burana, the first thing I did was cut the second half of the Brace Yourself video, the fast, crazy part, because that was a thing that had really inspired me initially. When I saw these shots of entire stadiums jumping up and down together, and that was the energy that matched that, and that this was always my thing with cutting music videos. Was my secret was always to try to match the music. Traditionally, filmmaking, uh, television commercial making was started with the picture, video, and then audio obviously came in later, not necessarily as an afterthought, but, it was picture dominant. When I started cutting music videos, I made the music God. I made the music dominant. That was my reference. And that's why I had success early on, especially with musicians, because they kind of recognized the kindred spirit, or somebody that, was into the nuances of what they were, putting into their recordings. So with Carmina Burana and people fainting and that crazy energy was something that really went together for me. And of course, the second half was the fun the fun part to do. So I did that first. And then, when it got down to the final crescendo of that was, my opportunity to use all these stills that Michael had thrown my way. And so that's where I did my version of my first boss's. It was called kinesthesis at the time. Kinesthesis was like an animation style of using still photographs in a quick cut kind of way. It was kind of the opposite of the Ken Burns effect, but a lot of what we had, there was an animator named Ken Rudolph who actually photographed these things on an Oxberry, which is an animation stand, and had made all of these short films. So doing these quick cuts at the end of Carmina Burana was kind of my tribute in a way to that, and also a way to work in more of this material. The second part of the Carmina Burana piece was virtually unchanged from how I cut it originally. And I'll tell you about the meeting and all that kind of stuff later. The first part of it, I think I had tried to make the historical retrospective go into the first part, so that I could, fulfill that part of the assignment of, doing this, Michael's history as a lead-in. And that was something that eventually we went through various permutations on. And it wound up the way it did with a lot of the emphasis was on Michael's Japanese tour of Japan. And part of what he loved about that was that Japanese audiences traditionally, no matter who it was, were incredibly polite, always sitting in their chair, clapping after a song. That was it. For people to be rushing the stage, for girls to be screaming and fainting and all that stuff was particularly unusual in Japan. And so that was something that Michael wanted to focus on. And as we were, had started fine tuning the piece eventually. So that, and then of course there's the build up to him being on stage. So that wound up informing the the sort of the concept behind the first part. But, that came a little bit once we were actually working together on this.
The whole thing just came together so well, and it just, when I first saw it, it just drew me in, the way it just sort of built and built and built, and then coming up to the climax and the whole thing. And particularly, as we'll get to, I'm sure, when they use that in concert to sort of set the scene and get everyone hyped up and excited, ready for what you're about to see for a full-length live concert. Like, the way it was structured was just amazing. And for a fan to see at the time all of those clips, and a lot of those clips we hadn't seen, some of the live concert stuff was not the Japan tour. It was like from other shows and all these bits and pieces. I think I was imagining, what it must be like putting something like that together. I'm actually curious a little bit about the technical side of it. Like, what sort of formats were all of these archive materials on, and what were you actually cutting on at that time? Was it like a tape to tape sort of system, or a 1-inch reel, or what was the system you were using?
It was a 3/4 inch.
Okay, like a U-matic, or?
There was, the dominant companies making video editing equipment were Grass Valley and CMX. And these were, expensive systems that were, controlling, everything from, 2-inch machines to 3/4 inch machines. There was a guy named Jack Calloway who was an engineer who used to work for Grass Valley. But these systems, they were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And as music video people, we could not afford to do our offline work on systems that were charging $500-600 an hour. This guy, Jack Calloway, developed a system that could control 3/4 inch machines that went through a small switcher, so that we could do dissolves and simple effects and green screen keys and stuff like that. But that cost a fraction. You could set up, instead of $500,000, you could set up editing 3/4 inch editing system with a deck that could do slow motion for like $120,000. And that made a big difference. I mean, I cut music videos on VHS systems that were cuts only, industrial systems, and all of that in an effort to be able to work inexpensively. As soon as, Paul, I'm sure as you know, as soon as you say, well, I'd like to do a fade out, or I'd like to make a dissolve, you're talking about a whole different level of equipment that was necessary to be able to do that. So by the time I was cutting this, I was working on this Callaway system with 3/4 inch decks, that could do slow motion and fades and dissolves. And those were really the basic tools of the trade. I thought, it was never into particularly video effects or, spins and wipes and all that kind of stuff. I was always tried to be a little bit more organic, so to speak, in that way.
Yeah.
Michael's library was, masters were either on a 2-inch, 1-inch. I'm sure there was, digital was, starting to make its way in, but some of the early stuff just, existed on
reels,
various, video formats. And then they would make dubs for me, 3/4 inch dubs with matching time code, of course. And so that's what I was initially working on, was 3/4 inch video.
So are you saying that you did an offline edit that later was overcut or onlined for this?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was all, the system was able to spit out an EDL.
Okay.
And so it was all, by the time we got to online, I mean, it was, basically an auto assembly. The machines just follow the EDL. But
EDL being an edit decision list, technical boring editors talk.
Correct.
It's basically everything that, it can sort of figure out what frame you started on, what you ended on. Was it a straight cut? Was it a dissolve? And then it can be recreated in the highest quality. And that's what basically an online is. It's making everything high quality, so you can start working cheaply, by the sounds of it, at low quality.
Yes.
And then later, once you decide this is exactly the final cut, they can spend the money getting it all into high quality and mastering it up and getting it ready for submission and broadcast.
Exactly. And you have to remember that, even though, let's see, VHS tapes were around on a professional level, 3/4 inch was the standard for offline or for viewing. Nobody had a laptop that they could pull up a file on and watch something. So
Yeah.
executives and record executives and filmmakers and studio executives, if there was something that was being worked on that they wanted to see the progress on, it was 3/4 inch video.
Yeah.
It was, ubiquitous in that way. And so, of course, it was much higher quality than a VHS tape, and also was able to carry time code, which is, the system for matching up a frame from the 3/4 inch video to the eventually ultimate master, so that, you could recreate the offline cut at high quality, as you were describing.
So talk us through, like you said, you've presented this cut and you got it ready, but then you had a meeting with Michael to go over notes and see the evolution and his final approvals and what he was thinking and his input. Talk us through some of that stage.
As I was working, and like I said, we were talking on the phone fairly regularly, but I think early on, as I said, when we were looking at other pieces of music, I may have sent him little snippets of this or that. But by the time I decided on Carmina Burana, I may have actually said to him, "I've got something that I think is good and that I want to pursue, but I don't want to show it to you because I don't want to spoil it." So, and he trusted me on that. And as it turned out, I don't think he had ever heard Carmina Burana before.
Wow.
So, this was, of course, at a time when, before it became the soundtrack for every movie trailer ever made. By 91, it was not nearly as ubiquitous. I had cut something to that on a documentary about New Orleans, about Mardi Gras, that I worked on with David Lynch's writing partner, Mark Frost. And we were doing a Fox documentary series called American Chronicles. And because after the success of Twin Peaks, everybody wanted to have a piece of David Lynch. And so he and Mark, who was his writing partner on Twin Peaks, came up with this idea of doing an offbeat documentary series about American institutions. And the first one was Mardi Gras. And for the finale of that, we used Carmina Burana. So anyway, I finally get to a point where I have a complete cut. And so I called Michael up and I said, "Hey, I'm ready to show you something." And he was working at Ocean Way Studios in the San Fernando Valley, and set up a time. "Why don't you come see me tonight?" And it was around midnight, that I went there with my 3/4 inch tape, and we set up in a room where it was a little screening room where they had a monitor and a machine, and it was just myself, Michael, and this guy Joe Wilcots. Now, do you know who Joe Wilcots is?
No.
I have heard that name. I wouldn't be able to pinpoint exactly who he was.
So Joe Wilcots was a cinematographer. He was actually, maybe his claim to fame was he was the cinematographer on the original television series Roots.
Okay.
Joe was the first Black cinematographer that was initiated into the American Society of Cinematographers. And I forgot how he had met Michael originally, but he became Michael's official videographer for quite some time. And in some ways, Joe was a little bit older. He was also a bit of a father figure for Michael. They had a very close relationship. I don't know. I think every time I saw Michael, Joe was there in some capacity or other. Very nice man, very very knowledgeable, a really good filmmaker. So it was Joe, Michael, myself, and so I put this tape on and it plays. And when it's done, Michael looks over to me and he's got a little bit of a grin on his face, and he goes, the first words he said were, "Oh, I see Jenkis is trying to hurt me."
Yep.
And I looked at him. I didn't know quite what to make of that. I saw that he was smiling, so I, figured he wasn't angry, but I didn't know what hurt me means. And so Joe jumps in and he said, let me explain something here. When Michael and Quincy were working on Thriller, they developed little, a language between themselves and little catchphrases that they would use in their workflow. And one of them was whenever they, and both of them used it this way, when they really wanted the other to really impress them, they would say, I really want you to hurt me.
Yeah.
So that's where that was coming from. And so for Michael to say he sees him, he always called me Jenkis, by the way. He never called me Bob. He always called me Jenkis. He said he saw I was trying to hurt him. I knew I was, when I realized that, I knew that I was in a pretty good place. And so we watched it, a number of more times, that evening. And then that's when we started talking about the opening part of it. He loved the ending of it. And like I said, I could almost swear that there weren't any changes made. The one thing that did happen, I know, two things. One was that in the final flurry of images, of still pictures and album covers and all that stuff, he wanted me to introduce the title "Dangerous," that red on black title. That was something I did not have in there originally, but he wanted that popping up actually a little bit more than I would have done. But
subliminal advertising.
He was, yes, he was the boss, and so there you go. But and that had actually come from David Lynch had made this a weird promo for the Dangerous album that
the teaser,
familiar with, that I was the editor on that. But anyway, so there was that, and then the animation of the fist punch at the end, that was something that we kind of came up with collectively. I even forgot how I originally ended it, but obviously with some sort of explosive something or other.
Yeah.
But Michael wanted to have the words "brace yourself" on there because you were going to be bracing yourself for the premiere of the black or white video. So that was going to be the lead in. And then Joe, through some contacts of his, I forgot who actually did the animation of that, but Joe kind of spearheaded that little, 2-second bit at the end. But other than that, the back end of Carina Brana was, pretty much the way I'd originally cut it. But the first part, that's where we talked about this and where the thing with the Japanese fans came from. And another thing that Michael had pointed to that he wanted was the military part of it was something that was dear to his heart. And
right.
So with the running with the policemen and the army guys or whatever it was, we started focusing in on that the first part became this, pre-concert lead build-up, so that's how that wound up taking shape. And I'm sure at one point I probably asked, I said, originally the idea was to have this historical retrospective, but at that point, Michael, the whole focus had shifted around this concert performance and this energized thing, and that so all the other stuff went by the wayside, aside from like the quick montage at the end, where I think I've probably covered something of every aspect of his career.
Yeah.
But it all wound up being centered around the performance aspect.
It's interesting as you're talking through that, I'm sort of having images of, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the history teaser that was for the next album and the next tour. It feels like what you created was a precursor to that, using archive footage, all the military and ramping it all up and then building and all the hype and the excitement. Later on, when he did the history one, it was like a dedicated short film that he created, and the narrative was all of this military stuff and all of that and the marching and all of the things, and then the build-up, and he had the statue and the whole thing.
Yeah.
But as an editor, from a structural point and a story point, it feels, and I'm just thinking of this now, it feels like Michael took that sort of thing that you'd created for Brace Yourself and said, look, I want to do something like this, but let's actually create a narrative to make a short film that does a similar thing that we can use for the next series of concerts and the next album and so on. So have you seen that thing, Bob, the history one with the statue?
Oh, yes. I was not directly involved in that, although
You were the inspiration.
yes, I may well have been. And the funny thing is that Michael actually, once that had been shot and was being edited, called me up and asked me to cut my own version of it.
Huh.
So I got all the footage from Rupert Wainwright, I believe was the director on that, and he was cutting it with a well-known commercial editor named Ry Dahlman. They gave me copies of all the material, and I went off and somewhere I think I've got a copy of what I did.
Wow.
I thought actually that what that piece eventually became, I thought was a little over the top.
That's Michael.
Really?
Well, he had to top what you did. That's the trick.
Well, exactly. And the thing was, with Brace Yourself, it was organic in the sense of that it was, even though some of the footage came from videos, it was real footage in a way.
Yeah.
This had obviously been specifically shot for that, and in some ways it looked like it. I mean, it was beautifully done. It was beautifully mounted and all of that, but it was like the formalized version of Brace Yourself. I forget right now what music I used. Crap! Now you got me. I'm going to have to try to find this or look this up at some point.
Oh, please do. Yes.
But when I showed it to Michael, he liked it, and I believe he literally said, "This is a softer, gentler version of history." I still had like the reveal of the statue and all that stuff, but I used some music, and I may well have been using classical music again, but something that was maybe, I don't know, dare I say, a little less grandiose or something like that. And he did like it, but it was not what he was looking for. But he liked it, and I think it gave him a contrast, something to bounce off of with what he was doing, so that what the final piece actually became was, he wasn't just working in a vacuum. He said, this is, yes, somebody could do something like this with this footage, but I want to do this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I did. That was another little side project that, that I worked on for him that never saw the light of day.
That's incredible. Absolutely incredible. And I would like to ask about, when you watch Brace Yourself and things like the history teaser and so many other things that Michael did in his career, even cuts of different concerts and different things, obviously a prominent thing that stands out in them is lots of crowd shots of fans like fainting and loving Michael and just cheering and all of that kind of stuff. And and as you go through his, the 90s phase of his career, even when you're looking at the live performances of songs like Earth Song, fans sort of jokingly sometimes call him like the king of propaganda, where it's like he's trying to create this messianic image of himself, even though that, huge adulation of him existed in reality. He kind of took that and sort of like amplified it in his video material. Did you ever have any explicit conversations with him where he was giving you the reason why he wanted to portray himself that way?
I want to say no. I never had any sort of specific or explicit conversation with Michael about the quote unquote messianic imagery or visuals that he might have created. My point with Michael, and I have to tell you honestly, before I met him and worked with him, I thought that way myself. I thought, this is, really pushing it and is kind of over the top. But after working with him and knowing him over this period of time, I really think that I always found him to be very articulate, very intelligent. isolated. Yes, he had a relatively small world that he lived in and that he trusted, but he was a very smart guy. And on that particular front, to me, his focus was on energy. He knew that his performance, and I mean energy in a spiritual sense. This, was, as I was talking about, brace yourself, is what I realized was it's a spiritual experience for him as well as it is for the audience. His performance, his approach to it, his attitude. When you're actually there on stage doing it, there is a communion that happens with your audience that is unlike any other kind of experience. And I think it was, obviously for some performers, it's addictive in a way. You don't get that anywhere else, and I think it may have been for him in some way that he thrived on it, and he gave as good as he got. So the more he gave, the more he got back. And I think, let's not kid ourselves that on at least subconscious level, there's an element of, they're worshiping me. Who doesn't like that? But he may have talked about. I'm just trying to see if I remember him saying the word adulation. And that is what a lot of that is about. So, like he wasn't, we may have talked about the Beatles and about Elvis, that even on that, it is what it is. But the point of, with at least my experience with Michael was that those moments are genuine. They were not staged, and that's why he would have cameras that would be shooting away from the stage, that would be shooting the audience through all the performances that he was giving, because that kind of raw, unadulterated responsiveness it's real, it's genuine, and that was obviously what he relates to that and values that.
Just before Paul sort of takes over a bit and moves into the dangerous concert section of our discussion, I've always been curious as well about those sections in Brace Yourself where Michael is filmed running with local police outfits from different cities that he visited. Did he ever talk to you about why he liked to film that and organize that with the different police?
He might have talked about that at some point, or at the very least that it had become a thing for him. I can't say I remember him talking about, why that was something that he liked to do or organize. But obviously there's a military thing that runs through a lot of his imagery. And I don't know.
He just loved it.
I'd just be making something up off the cuff now. I mean, we can all, probably talk about it in a similar way. My experience with him was not the why of it, but just that it is something that had been done a number of times.
Sure. Got it. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's launch into probably one of the big things that you were involved in, which is another iconic thing that in a way the Brace Yourself teaser became a part of. And we're talking about the Dangerous Tour and the Dangerous Tour concert film. Essentially, he did use the Brace Yourself as the warm-up to get the show going. And that wasn't something that was done that much at the time. Every concert you've seen by a pop artist in the last 20 years uses that as a model now. They all have an opening to their concert with some kind of video thing to get the crowd hyped up, and then eventually the entertainer makes their appearance.
Right.
The Dangerous Tour was like one of the first times to do that in a big way, using the Brace Yourself teaser and then having Michael explode out of the stage, making the ultimate concert entrance.
Right.
So what's fascinating about the Dangerous Tour, arguably it's not necessarily the peak of his performance career and the touring elements. A lot of people prefer the earlier tours, the Bad Tour or the Triumph Tour or the Victory Tour. But essentially the Dangerous Tour is really the only official concert film that was released and broadcast in a major way. Like, it's the main one that they've officially sanctioned.
Right.
So if any new fans go, oh, is there any Michael Jackson concerts? This is it. And it stood the test of time, and it's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing to me that you only had a week and a half or something to edit together this thing that would become the go-to thing for all time. But I'm fascinated to dig into this, and particularly to learn a little bit about the technical side of the formats that you were using, how you edited it in terms of how many cameras they used. I know that his standard concerts, he generally had like 4 camera operators for the Jumbotron screens.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming they brought in more cameras for the Bucharest taping so that he get more crowd shots and the crane and all these kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm fascinated to know all about how that came to be and the technical side of what you were working with. And did you have access to all the camera streams or switch it live as you went? And, you know, today we have Avid multicam and we can do it all digitally.
Right.
So, yeah, talk us through how that all came to be and what the technical process was and how it all sort of came to be what it was.
I have to backtrack a little bit because there's a little unknown story involved here that I don't know if anybody really knows about or not. And that is how a lot of that, including Brace Yourself, almost never came to be.
Mm.
As I originally told you, the original purpose for Brace Yourself was as a lead-in to the Black or White video. So once, Michael had approved the music and we did an online, and we did a mix on it where we were, mixing in crowd noises and some screams and stuff like that. That was something I remember sitting in a mix with Michael. It was in a motion picture theater. And he was literally telling the mixer to turn it up to 11. It was kind of funny because aside from, with film mixing, they mix to a standard loudness for a theater. That's, so everything has to fall within that window. And I don't think Michael realized that. And I think at some point he was, thinking about having this be theatrically released. So anyway, that was funny that the mixer had to explain to Michael that they couldn't go any further on making it louder. But so here's what happened, though. A week before the Black or White premiere, I get a phone call from my contact in Michael's production company, who tells me that Mrs. Orff, the composer's widow, who was in charge of his estate, denied use of the music for the video.
Wow.
And nobody quite, I said, what? Nobody had even, considered this. We thought, I mean, obviously Carmina Burana had been used, before. I told you about my experience with the David Lynch documentary that it was in. This was completely blindsiding everybody. If it were anybody other than Michael Jackson, that actually would have been the end of the story. That would have never gone one step further, and it would have been put on a shelf and put away. Michael, however, loved this so much that, well, first of all, let me interrupt here. So it was not part of the Black or White video premiere showing. They pulled out something that had been maybe done a year or so earlier. That was a much more traditional piece that they wound up plugging in to the Black or White premiere when that premiered on television. In the meantime, Michael at one point sent, I think, 3 lawyers to Germany to try to convince Mrs. Orff to allow him to use the music. And there are still people in, either Michael Jackson's office or his lawyer's office that I know, and, that still remember, like tearing their hair out over this because Michael would not let it go. And eventually they did give him approval, and for a very limited window of performance that he could use it in. Michael started using it to open the concerts on the Dangerous tour. And when they got to Germany, they were contacted by Orff's lawyers and said, if you use this music in Germany, you're going to be arrested. So now, and again, he sends the lawyers out, and eventually it all got smoothed over. But this was something that, if any of you have ever dealt with, music clearances before, and, it's in, especially in advertising, it's called demo love, where a lot of times we'll edit something to a piece of rock music or pop music, and that really makes the visuals come alive. And of course, everybody wants to use that. And it's rarely the case because the rights are always so expensive and, nobody's got money for that. This, would never have seen the light of day if Michael did not love it as much as he did. And then to eventually get the permission to, I think it's been on like 2 compilation DVDs that were released. But anyway, so by the time we get to the Dangerous tour, there was even a part of that where it almost didn't happen. So that said, as a background, when Michael was prepping for that, I was probably being paid, I want to say almost maybe a couple months before the concert actually happened. And that was for the purpose of, again, collating all this material that he wanted to use in the concert. And, frankly, we cheated a lot of stuff. We used things that we had used in Brace Yourself from earlier concerts that he wanted included in the Bucharest concert. And and that was why it was able to come together. I think it was 10 days between the shooting of the concert and it then being premiering on HBO. And yes, I think there were 10 cameras in the actual concert. And I did get what's called the live switch between those, but I also had access to all the raw footage from all the ISOs.
Yeah, because the live switch was actually broadcast. So I think they actually broadcast it live.
Yes.
And some of us have seen that version. And it's essentially just the live director attempting to keep up with Michael and the show.
Yes.
And they're often missing things, which is where the editing comes in. Like 3 of the biggest moments in that show, like when he explodes out of the stage, the camera misses it.
Right.
When he does the moonwalk in Billie Jean, the camera's at the wrong angle. When he does the lean in Smooth Criminal, the camera's not quite in the right spot. And even the Rocket Man at the end, didn't quite sort of sell it. So that's where, having access to all of the streams, all the different angles would have been the way to shape it and get it to be the ultimate uber perfect version of the concert that Michael would have wanted.
Yes. And it was with that purpose, going into it, which is why he involved me early on. I was not in Bucharest, but I did wind up doing all the work that I did in New York as opposed to LA, because HBO was in New York, and we wound up delivering the concert tape. I want to say 12 hours before it was on the air, which is also unheard of, And if it, again, wasn't Michael Jackson, you would have been 3, 4, 5 days earlier, or whatever, whatever the usual standards are. So I went to New York kind of well armed with all this material that he wanted to include. And then once the show had been taped and I got everything, I set up in like a little facility in New York and had initially a room that I was working in that had, I don't know, I could look at 5 or 6 cameras at a time. I don't think I could actually look at everything at once, but, they had setups where, like every camera was loaded into its own machine, and then they had little black and white monitors, that would play those back, and then I would edit from that into the program monitor or the record
Yeah.
side. And, my methodology with that was always with concert footage. I would look at everything against the existing cut. So I started with the live
The live switch.
cut and played every, and that's the thing. That's why I didn't even necessarily take advantage of being able to see 10 cameras at once, because to really get into the detail of it, you've really got to look at each one individually.
Exactly.
And so really what I'm doing is I'm looking at each individual camera against what had been cut. And whenever I saw something I liked better, in it would go.
Got it.
And so obviously it takes time to go through stuff like that. And very often you don't have the luxury of doing, but that's how I used to approach it. And that's how I did this.
So what format were you actually doing the edit on? And do you know what it was shot on initially, the concert?
I want to say 1-inch
Yeah.
video.
Okay.
It certainly wasn't digital at that time, and I don't think they would have done it on 2-inch, but 1-inch was kind of the
It
standard.
definitely wasn't film, we know that.
Right. And
Yeah.
I want to say 1-inch might have been the standard, and it was kind of the state of the art at the time.
Yeah.
And then of course I don't know if I was actually controlling 1-inch machines or whether we had dubbed it all down to 3/4 inch, because it's so much easier to pop 3/4 inch videos into a machine and they load up automatically than threading even a 1-inch machine, and it's setting it up properly, and there's a lot more technical stuff involved with that. And as long as you're making an EDL and the time code is tracking, it's much more efficient to edit off of 3/4 inch video. I could just take one out and throw one in. And as you become familiar with the material, you know which cameras have better coverage, and so on and so forth. So I think that's what it was. Eventually, along the way, we were starting to realize that to really go through this with a fine-tooth comb was going to take longer than the time that we had available. And so we started adding other rooms, and we brought in a couple other editors that were working under, my supervision. And whether it was adding in other crowd reactions, honestly, at this point, I don't remember if I want to say I was focusing on the, performance aspects of it.
So you didn't split it up and go, you take this song. You just sort of built layers and said, can you add some stuff to the, yeah, got it.
No, it pretty much all went through my hands. My wife remembers a story. Michael's people brought my wife out as well, because I was gone for 2 weeks or something like that. And they put us up in a nice hotel that I was never at, but that, my wife got to enjoy. And the facility that we were at, they were entertaining her, the evenings, going to concerts and theater and Broadway and all that kind of stuff, and out to dinner, because...
Did your wife bring you some pillows from the hotel or anything?
just about. She remembers, one night kind of late in the process of coming to see me after having been out at a dinner or a theater performance or something like that, and walking into the facility and everything being dark and quiet. And as she knows her way around at this point, and she's walking through, she said at the end of this long hallway, there's one room that has light on in it, flickering light coming out, and there are people asleep everywhere, on couches and in other rooms on chairs and stuff like that. And she walks into the this last room at the end, and there's me, and I'm still, going through the material. I think I was up for 3 days straight at the end. But so a couple things about that, though. First of all, Michael never showed up during the edit. I was talking to him, pretty much every day. But he talk about a memory of remembering moments, remembering specifics from not just that concert, right? The details of that. And I'm sure he was watching
Yeah.
the live cut that had been streamed out, but obviously everything else in his archive.
Yeah.
Talk about photographic memory. So we were talking every day, but the only representative that was there was this guy, Joe Wilcott's, that I
Right.
had mentioned to you. And I realized eventually that Joe was telling Michael what was going on, and he trusted me, and Michael trusted me. Joe saw what I was doing and said to Michael, "This is what's happening here, and you should just let him go."
Yeah.
So that led to one phone conversation where I can honestly say to have heard these words that nobody ever particularly gets to hear in their career, but Michael said to me, "I don't care how much money you spend, and don't let anybody else tell you what to do."
Wow. See, that's the thing. See, normally when you do a project like this, there'll be a very specific brief.
Mm.
And that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. Like, I'd be curious to know, like, I'll just give you some examples. A brief for something like this, and as a fan and familiar with this concert, I'd be curious to know if there was ever a brief that had things along the lines of, hype things up with more crowd, or make sure you use these particular angles for this dance move or that, or maybe some more controversial things like there's not a lot of close-ups of Michael's face in this concert.
Yeah.
So I'm like, did they ever say, oh, don't use close-ups? Here's another one, did they ever say, he's lip syncing certain songs, so be conscious of that and try and hide that in the cut? Or any of the illusions with the magic tricks, did they ever sort of give you a brief of things to try do or definitely steer away from?
Commonly known as executive notes.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
My experience with Michael was the stuff we worked on very personal. He, on numerous occasions when I was doing other things for him, he knew that, like his manager, for example, it's really a manager. It was Sandy Gallen initially, and I think somebody else along the way, that they would be calling at some point regarding whatever I was working on. And Michael would make a point to tell me not to listen to them. And he was the only one that had any say about anything. And, he and I would kick something around. And, you had asked earlier about whether I was at any of his concerts.
Yeah.
And I mentioned the Super Bowl performance. The reason I got there was the way Michael got or agreed to do the Super Bowl performances. They gave him a free minute of airtime and to promote the Heal the World Foundation. And that at the time, was a big thing that he was involved in. So I got the call to make this 60-second PSA for Heal the World. And I remember one of the things there that eventually we went, and that was something maybe that there was some outside input on, which was to put the phone number up for the entire minute of, because otherwise, if you see something for even 5 seconds or 10 seconds at the end of a spot, nobody's going to remember that. But at the time, there was the only way to donate or to be involved with an organization like that. So anyway, and then as a thank you for that, I got Super Bowl tickets. But other than that, everything I did with Michael, I had a few contacts in his office that would, either facilitate things or that I mean, a lot of times he called me directly. But when he didn't, I, would get a call from, some particular woman in his office that I don't know, worked for him for, I don't know how many years, was there from early on. and say, Michael wants to talk to you. When are you available this afternoon or something like that? Or the one time I got invited to go up to the ranch because he had a project that he wanted me to work on. And let me tell that story real quickly because it applies to what we're talking about here.
Sure.
About outside influence. The only time I was up at Neverland was I got a call one Saturday morning and said, Michael wants you to come up. He's got a project he wants you to work on. I said, so great. So it's like a 2.5 hour drive from where I was living, and I get there, and aside from telling you about that particular experience, which is a whole other story, what he had me doing was, the short film Ghost that Stan Winston did.
Yep.
Of course, we just recorded an episode about it a few weeks ago, actually.
Yeah. Well, here's a little anecdote about that. Michael apparently never really loved the sound work on it, not the music, but the dialogue, the crowd sounds, the ambiances, everything else that went along with that.
Yeah.
And it was, I want to say it was in August, and he calls me up there and basically gives me the assignment of redoing the soundtrack for Ghost. He says, it's going to be on VH1. It's going to be a big special for Halloween. And I want to present this with basically a reworked, updated, enhanced sound. So I said, great. So I hire the people that do Ridley Scott's movies. I'd worked with them before on some things, like a company called Sound Deluxe. And we get the stems and all the pieces from the original film. I take the dialogue from that, but we replace everything else. And of course, the music masters and the music stays the same. That was all done. But everything else, they recorded new Foley, recorded sound effects. You basically did it like you would do a movie. And then we were mixing it on a sound stage at Sony with an Oscar-winning mixer whose name I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember at the moment. But it was, like at least a 3-day mix because getting all these elements into play and weaving them in and all that stuff is not an easy process. It's like making a movie. And I don't know, I forget how Ghost is, 45 minutes long or something like that.
40.
Yeah, roughly. Yeah.
So, and I'm talking to Michael along the way. I was really hoping he was going to come to the mix because I was really proud of what we had done, and I wanted him to hear it in a real theater, and so we were all kind of looking forward to that, but he wound up, for some reason, never being able to make it. So I get home on day 2 of the mix, and this is now like, I want to say a week before Halloween, or maybe a little bit longer, and I get a call from the mixer, the lead guy. He says, I just got home. My kids have VH1 on, and they're showing our movie.
Wow.
And I said, what? So I turn on the TV, and sure enough, they're running Ghost. What had happened was that Michael never told anybody that we were doing what we were doing. And he wanted to surprise them. And he didn't realize that they had a tape that they had gotten, I don't know, maybe even from Michael's office. But they said, we're going to start running this, before Halloween and build up surprise and Michael Jackson and all that kind of stuff. And so that was actually one big kind of project in a way that never saw the light of day because of how Michael communicated with me and maybe sometimes with other people around him.
That's a shame, because I do notice that myself, that a lot of the crowd reactions you can't really hear. It's not full enough.
Yeah.
You can't really hear what's going on. So that would have been what it needed. But so that never saw the light of day ever? It never even after the fact?
Nope.
Well, there you go, Paul. I mean, it was just a few weeks ago you and I were talking on another episode about Ghosts and how many different versions there are, and the particular version that you got to see with Michael in the cinema at the worldwide premiere. And here we go. There's another version that people haven't seen before.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a shame.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious. So you're talking about doing a lot of audio work. Did you do the audio work on the Dangerous tour as well, or was that another department?
No, that was a whole. Oh boy, let me see. Usually, what happens with concert stuff is, the musician, takes the recorded tapes and they mix them in a regular recording studio. And as editors, we're working from essentially a scratch mix, or that comes off the board
Yeah.
at the venue. Sometimes this can, and there are always issues where maybe sometimes some things are highlighted in the final mix that weren't in the original mix, and I've done things where I've cut to particular musicians because I'm hearing them, doing a fill or something like that, and then in the final mix that's not there, or it got buried, and it's that's when I tear my hair out, but. In this one, I think I have to say I don't remember it specifically, but I'm sure that Michael delivered a master audio mix to the video facility that I was working out of, and
Right.
that at some point we replaced those tracks, and I think by the time like the last couple days when the last of it was coming together, I may well have been editing to what was actually the final track. A lot of times on other projects, these things happen one after another. Like once the video for a concert is cut, then they'll go in and they'll do the final audio mix and have the picture there.
Yeah.
But in this case, because of the amount of time involved and all that kind of stuff and everything that Michael wanted to have done, because obviously there was I literally was there the morning that the HBO person came and picked up the tape out of my hands and took it to HBO. So there was nothing else that happened. But
Yeah.
I'm sure we got a master mix at some point along the way. And
one of the reasons I ask is we might get to some talk about the video overdubs in a minute, but there's a famous part at the very opening of the concert when Michael opens the show with the song Jam.
Mm-hmm.
And in the live recording, it's a lip sync performance, but in the final HBO edited broadcast version of the concert that's on all the DVDs, etc., they've famously dubbed in some Michael ad-lib vocals on the opening of that song where he's doing his hee-hees and ows and trying to make it sound a bit more live just for the opening before the vocal starts. So do you have any recollection of that, or whose idea that was, or whether that just ended up in the mix that you weren't really a part of?
I don't, but you saying that which is quite possibly why I blocked it out of my memory, because that's the kind of thing that would drive me crazy. As you're saying that, I'm half remembering either some conversations or reactions around that, and that winds up something like that winds up being a fait accompli, because it's Michael and that's what he wants, and that's what we do.
Right.
So as much as I don't really recall ever having an argument with him about, on some creative level or something like that. One of the reasons he kept calling me, I think, and giving me projects was because he felt that I understood how he wanted to be presented. That, was the thing going back to Brace Yourself. When that time I was up there at Neverland for that project before we went into his theater, and we watched Ghost, and he told me what he was wanting me to do. I told him I had never been up to Neverland before, and so I said, well, give me a tour. And so we got in a little car, and he drove me around and
Awesome.
Showed me this and that. But he would always mention when we were on the phone that Brace Yourself is his favorite piece. It's the best promo, the best work that he and I ever did together. And the stuff that he gave me afterwards, I know was because of I knew how to present them, how to put it together.
Yeah. It sounds like there was a lot of trust there. And I mentioned a bit earlier about how, that maybe there wasn't even the need for a brief to say, make sure you choose these angles for the dance and the things like that. You seem to intuitively know those examples I gave about, the moonwalk in Billie Jean, etc.,
Yeah.
where in the live broadcast, the vision switcher sort of wasn't quite cutting to the right angles, but clearly
Yeah.
you knew which sort of angles would represent this and what would be the best for this
Right.
part. But the question I want to ask you is, it's quite commonly known that there were a series of video overdubs, as in, let's take some better moments from completely different concerts, because what's there in this particular thing maybe wasn't the best representation of that from the tour. Like famous examples are, the girl he brings on stage during She's Out of My Life, in the original concert was not necessarily the most excitable. So they've found, or you've found, another girl from a better concert where she went nuts and got dragged off the stage. And there's other moments throughout the concert where, they'll be like, oh, let's add some bits at the end of Man in the Mirror. He's climbing on a scaffolding and various things like that they've taken from other shows.
And those were things that we used in Brace Yourself as well. I remember being a little apprehensive about that. Saying that, won't people recognize this, as not, all. But, and if I ever said anything about that, I mean, and it would have been along the lines of, we've used this before. Is that okay to use here? And Michael did not care.
Right.
Again, it was about the energy of it, the dynamic of it. And for Michael, largely, the performance was all crazy all the time, and so to speak. But part of the trick of that, or part of what I saw as my walking papers, was to weave that in as inconspicuously as possible. To have the benefit of it without calling attention to it.
Exactly.
The thing with the girl on stage, honestly, I don't remember. And if it was something that would have been decided, relatively early on. And, we just did what needed to be done.
So anytime that happened where, because I understand that, like, I've edited things before where you go, we want to make this the best representation, say, of the concert. And unfortunately on that particular night, that trick or that gag or that move or that thing, the lighting didn't work. So we'll just swap that with another night, which is why normally with a live concert, they would shoot 2 or 3 nights and then combine to get the best performance.
Exactly.
But I guess my question is, any of those times that it was like, let's put this in, was that all coming from Michael? Do you remember saying, oh, I want to put this version in from here?
Yes.
It was definitely all a Michael sort of...
There was never anybody else.
Right.
We were doing his bidding, and that's where, he was intimately involved. And I can only say to my credit that, he didn't feel he needed to look over my shoulder, because he knew both, what I could do. And, obviously in this case, hearing from Joe, who was there all the time, always sitting in on the room. I mean, if Joe made a comment, it was something that he had heard from Michael, so he was a conduit. I think there was, I don't even particularly remember, I respected Joe's opinion, of course, and I'm sure I would ask him about things, but it would be, is this too much? Is this okay? Do you think Michael will like this? And more often than not, we were on the same page about that. When somebody turned me loose, I really got into the details of things, and and that's what he wanted. It served, it served his purpose.
Did you ever sort of, as you were going through it, I know this is something I would probably do, did you ever come across any moment where you're like, I don't think this is working, or we have what we need, and actually suggest or request that we find something from somewhere else? Or was it only things that Michael said, hey, let's put this in or put this in?
I think we had so much ancillary material to begin with, to work from. And, I actually like little hiccups, that's part of what makes something look live, what gives it a
Organic,
feeling of
natural
authenticity. I'll tell you guys a real quick story. I cut kind of a very stylized concert piece for Steve Miller once. He did an album called Blues in the 20th Century where he covered a lot of old blues songs. And a director named David Hogan at Propaganda did a really beautiful black and white concert. It was like a half hour, 40-minute concert film on a soundstage in Los Angeles where they played back rhythm tracks, but recorded live vocals, live guitar solos, and harmonica solos. And so I cut this. And then once I was done cutting, then Steve took it into the recording studio to do the final tweaking on the mix. Well, when I got the mix back, I was horrified because he made it sound like a record. All the Steve Miller tricks, the doubling of the vocals, every rough edge was smoothed out. Now, I had become friends with an engineer who's also a really good producer on his own, named David Cole, who has worked with Steve Miller and Bob Seger for many, many, many years. And I had become friends with him. And when I got the final mix and we were laying it into the video, I called him up and I said, this is, tearing me up because I think it's ruining what was original and unique about this project, which is, to have it, to actually appear live that they're playing. And his advice to me was, write Steve a letter. So I wrote Steve Miller a letter and I explained my position. And he actually went back and remixed it.
Wow.
And took out some of those things that he was usually doing on his records, but that gave it a little bit of a, more of an authentic feel. So anyway, back to Michael, I doubt that there was anything that I said, this isn't as good as it could be. I mean,
Right.
There were 10 cameras running,
Yeah.
and the performance is what it is. It's Michael. So I think, I doubt that there was something like you had mentioned earlier about maybe where the cameras just weren't in the right place at the right time. But there was always something that could be salvaged. And if not, we had a backup, maybe from another, pull this moment from such a concert. And if, try to weave it in, so that the lighting or the moment, whatever, looks the same. But I don't think that unless there really would have been a moment where all the cameras, and it's not impossible that might have happened, where everybody's for some reason is in the wrong place at the right time, the wrong place at the wrong time, but not in the sense that I don't think your performance is as good here as it could be. That was something he would have been on all over much earlier.
The thing I would say, about it, what in a way, in line with this kind of thought, is what's great about the official edited version of the concert film. When you watch, particularly the opening number, there's an energy and a life and a way you've captured what it's really like to be there and the excitement and the energy. When you compare the live feed switch, which people have seen, it's on YouTube, that's what I'm talking about. It's an example of they're switching to different cameras, but often they're not in the right place at the same time, and it's not quite building the energy. What you've been able to achieve is, particularly through the use of those crowd shots that you talked about, there's all these extra shots. So when he explodes out of the stage, somebody screams and all the different things, there's people fainting. And that's really created in the edit, and it's such impressive work. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on creating not necessarily what was truly, presented at the time, but giving that pure intention of what it really feels like that the live switch kind of missed or didn't quite capture, and it's achieved through your editing.
Right. Well, thank you, first of all. And that is what I strive for. Obviously watching something on a TV screen is very different than actually being there. And one of the things that I always strived for in editing concerts or performance videos was a little bit, as I had mentioned earlier, was giving the audience something that they wouldn't normally see. something that creates an enhanced experience of watching it because you're not actually there. And what can happen is, the screen becomes a microcosm. And that's one of the things that I always prided myself on in my editing was I could maybe, let's say I would make 10 cuts in something in a couple of seconds of something. But my goal was always to guide a viewer and create a visual dynamic. We used to call it shiny objects. It's like waving sparkly things in front of a baby that is creating something that you almost don't notice consciously, but that gives that video, that moment, a little pizzazz.
Eye candy, we call it.
Creates, yes, exactly, eye candy. That gives it a dynamic that is, meant to approximate what you might experience in concert. And that's where all this stuff with, you can't do that in a live switch. I think no matter how many cameras you have. But when there's that kind of music that's playing back and forth from an audience to the performer, that's where all this added material, helped to create that energy and those dynamics. And thank you for noticing. And I'm glad it's appreciated. But that's what he hired me for.
Brilliant.
Yeah, deeply appreciated. I mean, that particular concert was the first and one of only two, I think, officially released Michael Jackson concerts that fans can go and buy. Certainly the most widely available because, I mean, it's a standalone DVD that you can buy. Yeah. But also, I think from memory, the first time it was ever released was a DVD disc as a part of the 2004 release, The Ultimate Collection, a box set. And I remember taking an hour train ride just to pick up that DVD. And I feel really humbled, I guess. It's sort of come full circle and I get to talk to the guy who edited that. So thank you for all your amazing, brilliant work.
Thank you.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you had a trip to Neverland where Michael invited you there and you talked a lot about the conversation and why you went there. Do you have any memories about exploring the property with Michael and just what you thought of the location and the place?
Yes. It was August, so it was hot. And I remember driving up there and there were two guard gates that you go through to get there. And, of course, my name was, on the list and, they were expecting me. And as I drive up, there's a circular driveway in front of the main house. And there are old oak trees, and it's beautiful California rugged terrain. And these oak trees with these huge branches, kind of shading the area. There was a guy, like a valet, who, told me where to pull up. And I get out of the car, and there are three people standing on the walkway to the house, and this was, the thing that they did all the time, like in kind of a maid and butler outfit, and they all in unison go, "Welcome to Neverland." So I go in, and they guide me into a room to wait for Michael, and he, it was 2004. I want to say I took a camera along, but I was always very low key with. I never asked Michael for anything. I got some autographed pictures for some relatives, but I never asked for anything like for myself. I just thought that wasn't cool to do, and that wasn't the nature of our relationship. So, but anyway, there was this room. It had a lot of awards in it, a lot of things, beautiful things that he had collected, over the years and stuff like that. So that's where I was waiting, and it was about 15 or 20 minutes, and and he comes in, and he's wearing jeans and t-shirt and fedora. At that point, we give each other a hug, and he says, "Well, we're going to go to the movie theater, and because I want to show you something." And that's when I said, well, I've never been up here before. Would you show me around? So he said, okay. So as we're walking to get out to where the car is that he was going to drive me to the theater, and we passed like through one room, and obviously a lot of stuff that's almost like it's like a museum or something like that. But what I remember was this huge white grand piano that had all the family pictures on it, and and he we're standing there, looking, and he's just, kind of describing, the stuff, and he points to that famous picture of him as a kid in the Jackson 5, where he's smiling and, looking all angelic. He said, "No, this is me as a little kid." And he had pictures of Paris and Prince up on the wall. I forgot how old they might have been at the time, but he was just kind of taking me through his house, and then we went out, and he had this little electric vehicle that they still make, and I, for the life of me, can't remember. But it's literally like a two-seater,
Like a little golf cart.
almost, yes. But it's actually a car. I mean, I actually knew somebody that had one once, and I see him occasionally on the street, and I go, "That's what Michael Jackson drove me around Neverland in."
Yeah.
Anyway, he said he had gotten one of these little cars. So we took like a circuitous route, to the movie theater. And along the way, he's telling me how he's driving around, like what he normally does. And he said the other day he drove up into the hills a little bit, and he actually got stuck, and they had to call a tow truck to tow him out of there. And, it was all kind of pretty easy going. And he drove me through the zoo, but none of the animals were out. They were all in, but said, this is where all the animals are. And, and then there's another building that has a recording studio and, of course, a pool. And then, eventually, we drove by, the front, with the thing that looks like Disneyland. And then eventually we got to the movie theater, and the movie theater, was, I don't know how many, maybe could have sat 30, 40 people, something like that. It was like a little screening room. The only other guy there was his projectionist, who'd been with him for forever. So then we sat down, and he just talked about it. He said, I want you, this is the movie Ghost that Stan Winston did. And, I want you to watch this. So we watch it. And then, so after it's over, then, he's talking about what he wants me to do. And I'm sort of starting to get the picture of, this is a remix. I get it, what he's looking for. So I asked him, I said, can we watch this again? Talk me through it, point things out, that you particularly don't like. And do you have a like a pad of paper that, that I can take some notes on? So I look around, there's no paper, there's no pads. So Michael gets up and starts running around, looking in drawers and finding a TV tray. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, Mike, you don't have to do. I can go look for something. So no. So he brings me a TV tray and a legal pad and a pen and then we continue. But which was kind of sweet, and it sort of harked back to that first experience at his manager's house of trying to figure out how to get sound out of a cassette tape in his manager's house, and us like pushing buttons and running back. There's kind of a playfulness, kind of a childish playfulness that I definitely connected with him on.
Now we've got to explore this more, because whether you know this or not, what you're actually talking about right now is some things that are really unknown in the community in terms of like I had never known that Michael was working on Ghosts 7 or 8 years after it came out. We thought the final version, as a fan community, we thought the final version, the sanctioned version, was the 97 version.
Yeah.
So you're telling us that in 2004, you were working with Michael on a potentially final sanctioned version of Ghosts that you ended up doing. When you were with him in that initial meeting in his Neverland Theatre, was he talking to you specifically about the audio, or was he talking about a different cut of the film as well?
No. He was the cut is what it is. I mean, that was set in stone. But what he was, specifically talking about was the audio and all those, everything aside from the music numbers.
Yeah.
And I think we may have actually enhanced some of the, like again with crowd sounds or whatever the hell the scene needed at the time, so that it actually feels like a movie. That's not just all of a sudden there's a music video and then we're back to dialogue and sound, but just to weave it all together and do it on a higher level than what was originally created.
And what year was that was happening?
2004.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So 5 years later, Michael tragically passes away. And one thing we learn around the time that he passes away was that his late 80s manager, Frank DeLeo, had been brought back onto the scene. And Frank at that time was actually talking about Michael wanting to do a Halloween special that included ghosts. And I think there might have been some statues and different things that were made for it, but it never actually came to fruition. So what I'm curious about is in that Neverland visit, or even beyond that, into the late 2000s, did you ever have conversations with Michael about what ghosts could end up being used for?
No. What I was working on, came to its unfortunate end. I don't even know if we finished the mix. Like I said, we were in the middle of it at Sony with an Oscar-winning sound mixer, and we might have been close enough that it could have gotten laid off, but we were laid off to tape, in other words. But that whole thing came to a crashing stop as soon as the surprise of it was no longer relevant, and Michael's other people realized that I'd been spending a good amount of money on his behalf on something they knew nothing about.
I find it interesting too, though, that it did come to a halt, because the thing is that it had already been released. So the surprise wouldn't have been broken by it being shown on VH1 or whatever you said before, because it had already been released as a Laserdisc and a VHS in a box set in 97. Right. So are you able to explain again, like why was the wind taken out of the sails?
What Michael described and was that he his attention to detail and maybe to the detriment of realizing that there are other things going on in the world besides Michael Jackson things. He said, I wanted to present a surprise to the world.
Right.
Here's Ghost with a brand new soundtrack or enhanced soundtrack. It was something how, he always, I think would try to enhance something or create something new. He didn't just want to put the same old thing out all the time. And this was something that apparently had always been a little bit of a sore spot for him, or something he wasn't quite satisfied with. So he wanted to, like George Lucas, he wanted to have it the way he wanted it, and was actually happy with and proud of. And that was going to be the particular vehicle for putting it out in the world, which was this VH1 Halloween presentation.
Right. And I suspect that moving forward into those late 2000s years, he still hadn't put that to bed. I think from comments from different people that were working with him in the This Is It era, that was still something he wanted to complete and address as well. Now, looking back in these two distinct eras, so you were working with him in the very early 90s on Brace Yourself, on editing the HBO special. You were then meeting him again in 2004 at Neverland. And what's interesting about those two distinct time periods is those years, 92 and 2004, both preceded two sets of very unfortunate and controversial allegations, I guess. And this is a bit of a sensitive topic, but, surely, especially in the early 90s, when you were working closely with Michael on some of this material that would become very public, like the HBO concert, surely it must have been a massive shock to you, having worked with him in 92 and then just really less than a year later, hearing that he was accused of, child molestation. So what went through your head when you found out about those allegations?
To some extent, you you go through, what is it, the 5 or 7 stages of grief. I've been around long enough to take everything with a grain of salt. And what I've said to people in the past that ask about that is, my experience is that there is nothing that indicates or hints at that kind of behavior or incidents. People have complicated lives, and there's obviously a lot of things that people do, all of us, do that maybe even the people closest to us aren't fully aware of. It's kind of the nature of life. This is obviously, something very serious, very abhorrent, and given Michael's attention and awareness of children and childhood, he said to me at some point, this might have been in 2004, that why he was doing something was because he never had a childhood, and why this was so important to him. Oh, it might have been, I think, as we were walking through Neverland, and there was a room where he had some really big, I think they were Lego houses, but I mean really sophisticated, big, sophisticated stuff. And there's a lot of, the whole Disneyland thing at Neverland. So, and he said to me, this is, I do this because I never had a childhood, and he wants other children not to lose that, not to lose their own childhoods. I know a lot about psychology, and I know my wife comes from a rough home environment and is very sensitive and aware of those dynamics. And I'll tell you that, she talked to Michael on the phone often, because he was calling the house. But I took her to meet him once. And it was actually during when Fincher was shooting his video. I was doing something else for Michael at the time. And I'd asked him, I said, my wife, you've talked to my wife, she's never met you. Would you mind if I brought her by to say hi? He said, no, of course not. So we were there on the set, and he was in he had a trailer, and we got in. There were a few other people ahead of us that had something to run by him. But then, he came up, we said hi. I introduced her, said hi, shook his hand. She's said she never picked up the slightest vibe that he might have that kind of stuff brewing underneath. She saw the childlike, she even may have said the lost child in his eyes, seeing him out of context, so to speak, but she never picked up anything from him. And she's very energetically conscious, aware, and sensitive that would indicate that. And that is my position on that. And I believe that. And I can say out of my own experience that I never saw anything that would make me think otherwise.
That's beautifully said. And that's what we hear from time to time when we talk to all of the different collaborators that worked with Michael. Something that really warms my heart is the fact that you were physically there for him really during his darkest hour. We've also spoken to people that worked at Neverland, some of his close staff, that have talked to us about how, you wouldn't believe how quiet his world became in sort of 2003, 4, 5, when he, those allegations broke out. A lot of his, quote unquote friends or celebrity friends kind of just ghosted him and distanced themselves from him. But to hear that you were there physically with him and for him during his darkest hour, and he was able to walk through Neverland with you and talk to you about his relationship with children, I find that to be really, really heartwarming. So thank you for sharing that story with us, Bob.
I'll tell you one last thing. My history with Michael is there were like every couple of years was something that would come up, and that he wanted to use me for. There were other number of like little promos and montages along the way. When he would get an award, and they would have a little something or other. The last time I didn't speak to him, but I came up in conversation. The year that he passed, in January of that year, I was in New York working on a TV commercial, and I get a call from a woman who is working for AEG, I think was the concert promoter that was setting up the concerts, right? And she said, you don't know me, but I tracked you down. We're starting to make TV commercials and promos and trailers for Michael's concert series, in London. And he's not been happy with them. And when we asked him for feedback, the only thing he said to me was, "Find Bob Jenkis."
I love that.
Perfect.
So
I love that.
She called, and then she sent me what they had been doing. And, interestingly enough, and because this ties in with the rest of our conversation, was what I told her, they were fine. They were fine promos, but they were all focused on Michael. And so I told her the story about Brace Yourself and the conclusion I had come to about Michael in relationship to his audience and what that meant to him and how it was important for the dynamic between the two of them to be seen and respected. And so my advice to her was to dig into those moments, including Brace Yourself and the concert, and to include those in these. And she did. And I think it might have been after Michael passed at that point. This woman and I got together. We said, I think we need to have a drink together. And she told me that he did like them and he did approve them after that. But that was the thing that made the difference.
I'm curious. I mean, this whole This Is It era, unfortunately ended in such tragedy. After you finished working on that promo for the concerts, or should I say during that time, was there much interaction with Michael in the same way that there was during the Brace Yourself editing, or was this more of a thing that was handed over to you? Did you ever get feedback from Michael on it?
On what? I'm sorry.
Sorry, maybe my understanding is incorrect, but you worked on a promo ad for This Is It, right?
No. I never did.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought you actually ended up working on it.
No, the production company, the concert promoter had people doing these, right? But he wasn't happy. They sent him to me, and I just told him what I thought Michael would want and why.
I see.
And so then they went off and took my advice, and apparently to good effect. But I actually never did that myself.
Right. Sorry, I thought eventually you circled back and actually did that.
No.
And that kind of makes sense now, because when I watched the This Is It promo, like I watched it last night, the video that was actually shown right before Michael got on stage to do the press conference, it actually kind of feels like Brace Yourself. Like there's a orchestral score with a choir, and then there's lots of quick cuts to different highlights of his career. Yeah, it's sort of, you can tell that the inspiration or the advice you gave them obviously was there, because what ended up being shown before the press conference was kind of similar.
And I'll tell you that after he passed, his office invited me to the memorial celebration at the Staples Center in LA, and gave me some tickets for that. And as I was talking to the woman who is my main contact at MJJ, she said the first thing out of his archive that Michael pulled to be included in those concerts was Brace Yourself.
Wow, I just got goosebumps.
Like I said, that was really, it set the tone. It was the template for everything that came after. And it was just, I'm just amazed at how even the choice of the music, the Carmina Burana, was just something that you came up with. And then all of your input should never be underestimated or undervalued, because not only did you create something that was so incredible, but it continued right through to his career, right to the very end, as the tent pole of this is what we're aiming for. And it seems like everything was based on that in some way. We got to do something like that, or try and better that. That's like the golden sort of
the gold standard.
exactly.
It really became that. And I mean, I would tell you straight out, I think it's the best thing I've ever edited.
Wow.
It almost did not come to pass. That unlike the Ghost remix, when Mrs. Orff says no to Michael Jackson, like I said, if it would have been anybody else, that would have been the end of it. But he loved it so much that it spoke to him, and it spoke to how he saw himself and wanted to be presented. I've showed that to a lot of people, that friends of mine that have said, I'm not really a Michael Jackson fan, but after seeing that, I want to go back and check him out again.
So around this time, I mean, right up to the very end, I mean, do you remember the last time you even spoke to Michael, and eventually like how you heard about his passing?
I'm pretty sure that visit in 2004 was the last time I actually talked to him as well. I remember distinctly where I was when I had an appointment or something in Beverly Hills, and I was driving home, and I was at a stoplight when I heard the news. It was like one of those surreal moments, like the Kennedy assassination or John Lennon being killed, that just seemed so out of the blue, that it was unbelievable. And I was on my way home, and of course when I got home and seeing my wife, and we both were in tears, because he had been a part of our history together, and we have obviously lots of stories to tell from that are I mean there's some other stuff that I could tell you on another time that were a little bit more personal stories that speak to me about what kind of a person he really was.
A question that we ask every special guest that we ever have on the MJCast that's known or worked with Michael, and I want to ask you the same question, is how do you think Michael Jackson should be remembered?
Do you know what? I think the final words of, I believe, at least in the movie, the final words in the book, The World According to Garp, as he's on his deathbed, he says, "Remember everything." And that's what I would say about remembering Michael. All the good and the bad and the little and the big creates the full picture of who someone is. With somebody like him, his genius is, obviously very well documented. And I think as time goes on, and maybe as some of these behind the scenes stories come out, you realize just how involved and how intimately he knew all the details of everything that he was doing. It was such a unique life, from childhood on. But all this other stuff is unfortunately a part of that story as well. I remember reading the book Michael and the Madness, I think was
Magic and the Madness.
Yep.
Yeah. That writer's conclusion that the plastic surgery stuff may have been an attempt to not wind up looking like his father. That's some really profound, basic, human, fundamental stuff that affects, that we all have maybe versions in our own lives of what shapes us into the people that we become. And so I think it all becomes a part of the big story. First and foremost, he's a musician and a performer, and a brilliant, unique one at that. But my experience with him was as a human being, and I liked him and I appreciated him, and I think we did some good work together.
Amazing. So Bob, the contribution that you've made to Michael's legacy is significant and long lasting and classic. And some of those pieces of work are the go-to pieces that fans will continue to enjoy, and new fans discovering Michael's legacy for many years to come. And they're all a part of a lot of the officially released issues and DVDs and various things that are out there. And hopefully that they will continue to be a part of that, and possibly even restored into higher quality in the future, and preserved, because I do 100% feel what you're saying, that Michael thought this was one of the best things he'd ever done to represent what he did, his art, and also one of the things that you're most proud of as well. So congratulations, and well done for just having that as part of Michael's legacy and being able to achieve such great work in your career.
Thank you. It's definitely been a high point.
So I guess we might wrap things up by asking what's next for you. I mean, you've had a long and illustrious career, and you're sort of winding things down and hopefully enjoying the fruits of life, and not staying up for 3 nights in a row trying to meet crazy deadlines. What's next for you? And
hey, sometimes that can be fun.
Absolutely.
Just a very quick side story. My wife has a special needs brother who lives with us. He's cognitively impaired, but he's like a big kid, and he loves movies and music and all that kind of stuff. But he's 65, but he's like an 8-year-old. And so I just made a little Halloween. Halloween is his favorite holiday of the year.
Awesome.
And so he and I just went out and made a little horror movie.
Amazing.
Where my wife had found one of these like mechanical zombie hands at a drugstore, and bought it for him. And we started riffing on it and said, we should make a movie for Raymond is his name, and where the hand is chasing him around the forest. And so, we did that. And with, technology the way it is now, and I shot it on my iPhone in 4K and edited it on my laptop. And,
nice.
It's amazing what you can do now. In some ways, I unfortunately can't quite afford to retire. And so I worked on a movie last year. I've been doing little documentaries here and there. I'd actually love to get into some concert work again. And I'm one of the regrets that I've had is that I didn't pursue more of that at the time, because I've always liked having kind of a broad range of projects to work on. But there is something about concerts and music and picture that is really close to my heart. So I'm looking for opportunities.
Great.
See, I feel like what would be great though is, and one of the criticisms of the Michael Jackson estate is kind of how much they don't necessarily contact back to the original creators of things and collaborators with Michael to, bring their visions into the current technological reality. But how awesome would it be if we could get like Bucharest again, but a newly remastered and edited version that you've overseen, or even Brace Yourself, recreated now, but using rescans of the original footage. And oh man, there's so much stuff the Michael Jackson estate could still do if they could just reach out to you again and make that happen.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I had actually just recently had exactly that thought, because I was talking to some people. My wife had put Brace Yourself up on her Facebook page, and just got lots of positive responses. And it made me realize that, just even for my own kind of bookending maybe of my career, that exactly that kind of thing that you're describing might be something not just good for me, but good for Michael. And so I still have a contact there, and I've actually been looking at what fans have done, like with AI, for example, and to kind of be educated on what the current state of both fandom and what the estate has released is, and maybe be able to pitch them on an idea that we can put those things together on for exactly that kind of let's say update. So I'm all for it.
Fingers crossed.
Amazing. Well, we here at the MJCast, man, we're behind it. Let's go. Let's go.
Absolutely.
There you go.
All right. Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining us here on the MJCast. I know that you have been chatting with my co-host Elise for a little while now about making this happen, and we just feel so really honored that you've been able to share your story with both Paul and I and our audience about getting to know Michael, working with Michael, building a friendship with him. What a special thing that we've been able to capture. So thank you for giving us so much of your time today.
You're very welcome. And I'm happy to do it. You guys, what you do sounds really great. My wife Laura was the one that got the connection to Elise through, I think, another woman, the one that worked at Neverland for a while. I think she was at the guard gate.
Violet, probably, I think.
Yes. I think that was the name she mentioned. So my thanks to Laura, my wife, also for helping to make this happen. And it's really been a pleasure.
Wonderful. Now, all of our listeners, I'm sure they're going to have questions above and beyond what we have asked. Is there a specific place online that you are, or maybe your website or social media, that Michael Jackson fans can use to reach out to you?
I would suggest my website. I do have contact info there, at least for starters. I mean, I have no idea what kind of a response we might get, and if it gets either out of hand or we need to expand on that. I mean, I am on Facebook under Bob Jenkis, and my website is bobjenkis.com. I talk a little bit about my relationship with Michael in my bio, and of course, Brace Yourself is up there. So I would say let's start there and see where it goes.
That's wonderful. And of course, listeners know where to find us as well. We are on Instagram, Twitter, Mastodon as the MJCast. We'd love it if you could subscribe to us as a podcast. Of course, we are on YouTube as well, but we're best heard as a podcast. So we're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Spotify. We'd also love it if people could reach out to us through email and give us feedback on the episode or the season and how it's gone so far. We're at the MJCast at iCloud.com. Our website is themjcast.com. There's a couple of cool things on there as well people can go to if they would like. We've got a link on there to our shop, themjcast.com/shop, where you can buy merchandise like, t-shirts and things like that to celebrate Michael Jackson and the MJCast all at the same time. And we would love it if you could check out our website. We will be back shortly, I believe in a couple of weeks or even less, with our Christmas special for this season to wrap up the 9th season of the MJCast just before we move into our 10th season. Oh my goodness, can't even believe it. But thank you so much to all of our listeners for tuning in to listen to this amazing story with Bob Jenkis and also with Paul Black, both professional film editors from other sides of the world. It's been really special being able to hear both of those guys geek out. All things Michael, all things film. So thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. Have a great fortnight ahead and keep Michaeling.
So I have one other little story to add to my time working on the Bucharest concert that I think would be of interest and is much more on a personal note. While I was preparing for the concert, I think I had mentioned that Michael had been calling me weeks or even a month beforehand because there were things out of his library he wanted me to pull together to have available to potentially use in the concert. So he was calling me on a regular basis. And the way that worked was that a lot of times he would call like at 7 o'clock in the morning. And what he was doing was, my understanding was that he often drove around LA in, I think he had like a 57 Chevy or some sort of classic car like that. And he would drive around town before the traffic really started, because it's the only time that he could really be out in public spaces without getting mobbed or recognized. So a lot of times our phone would ring at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the phone was over on my wife's side of the bed. So she would answer. And I think I had mentioned that Michael always called me Jenkis. He didn't call me Bob, but called me Jenkis. So she would pick up the phone, say hello, and he would say, "Is Jenkis there?" And of course, she recognized his voice, so she would just either hand the phone to me or tell me it's Michael, and I would go into my office that was right next to our bedroom and pick up the phone, and then we would have our conversation. So after this had been going on for a while, my wife Laura is no shrinking violet, and one time I had gone into the office to talk to him. Or as I was going in, she had put the phone on hold, and as I'm leaving the bedroom, she says, "Tell him it wouldn't kill him to say hello to me one day. He's been calling often enough, and I'm sure he recognizes my voice." So, I kind of laughed and I said, "Oh, okay." So I went in the office. We had our conversation, and before we hung up, I said, "Hey, Michael, my wife wouldn't mind if you said hello to her if one morning you're calling early in the morning, and if you said hello to her before you asked for me." And he said, "Oh, okay, fine. Oh, sure." So we hung up. 2 minutes later, the phone rings again, and I picked it up. It's him. And he goes, "Can I talk to your wife?" I said, "Oh, sure." So I put the phone on hold. I yell out, I said, "Hey, honey, Michael's on the phone for you." And of course, at this point, she's thinking, "Oh my God, what have I done? What's he going to say?" And so she picks up the phone, and he talked to her for 10 or 15 minutes, apologizing and explaining. And he said, "I'm so sorry. I don't want to come across as rude, but I have so many things on my mind and things I'm thinking about that I'm really just focusing on what I'm thinking about in the moment. And I'm not really paying attention always to who I'm talking to. So I'm so sorry. I don't mean to be rude, and please forgive me." And he was really sweet, and he really took the time to explain that. So that was that. Now, fast forward to I had talked about my editing on the concert film, and how long and intense a period it was, and then delivering it to HBO, just 12 hours before it was on the air. And after the concert aired, I thought I would hear from Michael in some form or other, because I really was curious if you liked the way it turned out and all that. And I didn't hear anything. So after about a week, I called his office and I said, "I'm a little concerned. I want to be sure he liked it, that he was happy with the work that I did." And I hadn't heard anything from him. And my contact at his office said, "Oh, no, don't worry. Believe me, if Michael doesn't like something, you're going to hear about it right away. But if he's happy with something, he's moving on to the next thing. And he doesn't think about it at all anymore. He's just moving on." I said, oh, good. Okay. Glad to hear that. Okay. So a few more days go by, and I get a call from his office, and they said, "We're just wondering if you're going to be home this afternoon. Michael wants to send a gift." I said, "Wow, oh, sure, cool." So we were home that day in the afternoon, and the doorbell rings, and we open the door, and there's a delivery guy standing there with probably the biggest gift basket we've ever seen in our lives. From some Beverly Hills boutique with champagne and perfumes and flowers and treats and just one of these kind of classic shrink wrapped gift baskets. He's holding it with two arms. And so he said, "Wow, thank you." So we take it from him and we bring it inside and put it on the table. And, there's a card on it. And so we pick up the card, and it's for my wife. It's for Laura.
Wow.
And we open up the envelope, and the card says, "Thank you for your patience and understanding. Love, Michael."
Oh, wow.
So after all that time, he had obviously remembered that earlier conversation and, sent it to her as a thank you. And we really felt that, was an indicator of what kind of a thoughtful, considerate person he really was.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. It just goes to show how, sensitive Michael was. That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Yes, and remembering and all that. He did send me something a few days later. I don't remember exactly what it was, like a Sony. It might have been like a player recorder type thing. It was sort of a technical gift. But this, to think of her first and to put it together in that way and to remember that was something that always touched us and stayed with us.
Do you guys still have that in your house, that note?
Somewhere, I'm sure we do. I think it's in a file with, memorabilia that could be in storage at the moment. But of course, I think we've got it stashed away somewhere.
Beautiful. There we go, Bob. That's perfect.
I think it's a good touch, and it's the kind of thing you don't necessarily hear. It's not something I trot out all the time when talking about Michael. But I think given the nature of the podcast that you do, and you and your audience would appreciate that. So.
Thank you. Yeah. That's what I like to really capture is when we're talking to people who collaborated with Michael, it's those sort of little side stories that people have about him and his personality and things he used to do. You learn the most interesting things. Like I've spoken to people that have said that he used to drive around in a pickup truck sometimes by himself without anybody else. Yes. And he was apparently a terrible driver.
I think I may have included that in when we were telling the story about being up at Neverland, that he had told me this little electric car that he had, that he used to drive around, that he had gotten stuck in a ditch the day before, and they had to call a tow truck to pull him out. So.
Yeah.
It's funny how those things are. One other little story I had once was, and this was before being up at Neverland, and maybe in the earlier years of knowing him, and working maybe on some sort of montage for him accepting an award or something like that, and they were going to play a little kind of greatest hits thing, and I was putting it together. And I, again, went to a recording studio that he was working in to show him what I was doing. And it happened to be the day that Rick James got arrested for, I think he was accused of holding like a couple girls hostage or something like that. And he had gotten arrested. And when I went to the recording studio, the TV was on and the news was on. And there were a handful of us and Michael standing around watching it. And after the story aired, I made some crack about Rick. Some kind of smart ass comment, and everybody laughed. And Michael looked at me and he goes, "Oh, Jenkis has a sense of humor." And I sort of thought that was funny because I said, I mean, I didn't say this, but I thought, well, we've known each other for a while, and I think you would, realize that, maybe at least I was a smart aleck, but, maybe a lot of times those things don't come through because when you're working, you're focused and talking about what you're dealing with, and making kind of side comments isn't necessarily a part of that. So you don't realize until something like that comes up.
I love that story. That's brilliant. Thank you so much for that little bonus.
Anyway, listen, Jamon, thank you. I really enjoyed my time with you.
Thank you.
I hope maybe in some way our paths cross in the future.
Sounds great to me. Thank you so much, Jenkis.
Okay. Okay, now you just have to work on your the tone a little bit, raise it up a little bit, and your Michael impression.
There we go. Thank you.
Take care.
Merry
Have
Christmas
a good day.
and have a great holidays. Thank you.
Bye-bye.